Well, welcome to RUC people, and today we're joined by Dr. Laburn Peart, and we're going to have the chance to get to know Kate a little bit better. Kate's been part of our community here at RUC for quite a few years now, and is known to many of you, and her regular sidekick Charlie, who hasn't joined us this morning. But welcome, Kate. Thanks for being part of this today.
Thanks, Russell. Thanks very much.
So, Kate, take us back to the start. Tell us a little bit more about where you grew up and your family background and, the early years.
Well, I'm a Joburg girl. I was born in Joburg and spent first 40 years of my life in Joburg. One of 6 girls in a family, so it was a large family. I was number 4, so you can read into that what you want about birth order and any personality traits that might come with it.
No boys in the mix.
No boys. Six girls. I think my dad wanted a boy, but he welcomed all of us as school daughters. But they gave up after 6, I think. So, and I had a very normal, white, middle-class upbringing in obviously a very abnormal society. But I didn't know any different. So I had a very happy upbringing, very happy childhood, went to the local government school and took part in all sorts of things that you do growing up as a child. I was conscious that my dad had an important job. He was the chief engineer of the Rand Water Board, so it fell on him to supply the Waterstrand and beyond with water. And so we were very conscious of water and water quality and water conservation actually was a big deal in our family, in our household growing up. But just thinking of the implications of my dad holding that job, he was also a very non-political person, and we in the family never really talked about politics. Even though I grew up in the 1960s, 70s South Africa, which was very heady times politically going on around us, I was completely, I guess, protected from it because my dad was conscious of his senior position in what was a state-owned organisation, and he couldn't rock the boat. He couldn't become politically involved. He would sometimes refer to the Broederbond, who tended to run that organisation, and I gathered from dinner time conversations that he didn't necessarily agree with what they were saying, but it was just not talked about. So I had a very apolitical upbringing in that sense.
And school?
Well, hang on, I want to come back to that. Except for my mother, who from very early on, so when I was a tiny baby, my mum met a woman called Evelyn Kashani, who in those days was sent to her by the Non-European Affairs Department in Johannesburg when my mum applied for domestic help. And Mrs. Kashani arrived with a baby on her back to come and work for my mother, who had 4 children. And I think one on the way, but no, not one on the way yet, 4 children. Mrs. Kashani arrived with a baby on her back. And these 2 women struck up a friendship that lasted until they died. It was an extraordinary relationship across the colour line between these 2 families. Mum ended up with 6 daughters. Mrs. Kashani ended up with 5. So between them, they had 11 girls. And a friendship that just was extraordinary given the times we were living in. And given my father's situation that I've just described, Mum just had this person that she cared for and liked and was a friend with. So during my childhood, some of my early memories are of going after church on a Sunday, going to the Rand Waterboard offices, and for my dad to get a permit to go into Soweto, because white people needed a permit to go into Soweto in those days, and going to visit the Kashani family. And it was just for me, it was just a normal thing to do. Look, they lived a long way away. It was a bit of a schlep, but we went to visit them. And Easter holidays and Christmas holidays, the 3 younger Kashani girls would come and stay with us for their holidays. And it was just what we did. I never questioned it. So thinking about my upbringing and my childhood, those were 2 very important things. The one is we don't talk politics, but the other is we live out a different politics from what's going on in the world very quietly and just doing it, which was, looking back on it, probably quite an extraordinary and I think a very formative thing for me to go through.
And what about your school years?
School years were pretty uneventful in the sense that nothing extraordinary. I was preceded by 3 very high achieving sisters, and I went to the same primary school and the same high school as they did. And when I arrived, I was yet another Laburn girl, and I was going to no doubt follow in their footsteps, which I didn't. I didn't achieve the full colours and the head prefectship and everything else that my elder sisters had achieved. And I guess, I don't think it had a lasting impact on me, but looking at it now, it was probably one of, a real experience of failure, or a sense of not being as good as others in my family, which my upbringing up until then had been completely carefree, and I hadn't thought about those things. But I don't think the scars are very deep on that front.
So going through school, was it a happy experience, and did you start to have stirrings of what you wanted to do when you left school?
I had not a clue. I had a very happy school. I was a very sporty person, so I took part in activities, and I was just one of the gang, and it was very happy school life, both primary school and high school. And not a clue of what I wanted to do with my life. When the opportunity came, I applied for and got a Rotary Exchange award, which sent me to America for a year in 1972. And I remember my dad saying to me, it'll be really good for you to go and see the world, get out there, and you've got a year to decide what you want to do. So that was the mission. You go and have an exchange year in America and come back and you'll know what you're going to do with the rest of your life. Well, that didn't happen either. I mean, I came back and I still really didn't know what I wanted to do. I had a fantastic experience, but...
Where in America did you go?
I went to a small town called King of Prussia. Yes. King of Prussia, which is just outside Philadelphia on the East Coast. And I stayed with 3 different families there and went to school there and travelled quite a lot in America and saw a lot of the country. And yeah, it was an amazing experience. Although for a while I kept contact with the people who I had lived with and been friendly with, but that's all faded over the years.
So back from America, not sure what you want to do with your life. What happened then?
Well, my dad, again, a very influential person in my life, he sat me down, he said, look, let's just think about what you are interested in, what courses you might want to do. And so we chose a series of courses. And then he came back to me and he said, my dad, of course, was an engineer and a man who wanted a son, and the closest he was going to get was a daughter who might be an engineer, I guess, was his thinking. But he said to me, look, there's a course here that WITS is running called Town and Regional Planning. And if you do the first year in Town and Regional Planning, you do geography and sociology and maths and a few other subjects. If you get to the end of that first year and it's not for you, you've got credit in those other subjects. You can change. You're not committing yourself. So that sounded like quite a good idea, and off I went and enrolled in the 4-year course of Town and Regional Planning. And stayed for 4 years and completed the course and loved it. I was part of a very close-knit group, small class. 31 of us enrolled in the first year, 13 graduated after 4 years, and apart from 2 who have died, we are still in touch to this day. To the point that one who passed away in the last couple of months, I literally had to make one phone call and everybody, or one WhatsApp thing, and everybody knew. We were a very close-knit group and have remained so. So my university friendship group was the one that was more influential in my life than my school peer group.
And did that start to bring any clarity about where you wanted your life to head?
Well, I met somebody who was actually part of that class, who I ended up marrying. So that did rather point me down a particular path. And yes, I think, it was something I was interested in. I was not interested in town planning and working for the local authority, which is what I did for 3 years after I graduated. I was more interested in communities, in community development, and in, as it happened, in rural issues. That's really what interested me. But that was 1977. It was a tough time in South Africa, and that was absolutely not what the profession was focusing on, even though they should have been. So it was not something that I found a professional outlet for. Yeah.
And so, got married, worked for the local authority for 3 years. At that stage, did children come into the equation and, juggling marriage, children, career? How was that period?
Yeah, well, you got the order slightly wrong there. I worked for the local authority for a few years, and then I moved and I worked for a research organisation. And during that time, I studied anthropology, which links in with my interest in communities and in Indigenous communities in particular. Got married eventually, yes, a number of years later, because my husband switched from town planning to medicine straight after we graduated. So we waited until he'd finished his medical studies before we got married.
Well, that's a long haul.
It was a long haul, but we were in love. It was worth it. And I was working and so supported while he was studying. And it was fine. It was what we were doing. I was working and studying, and he was studying. So yeah, we got married, and then part of his deal with studying medicine was that he had a bursary with what was then called Anglo-American, and that meant he had to work for them after he'd finished his medical studies, which meant working on a mine. So soon after we were married, we were sent off to Orkney, which is not Scotland. Orkney, in what was then the Western Transvaal, Northwest Province now. To Vaal Reef's mine, it's changed its name as well. So for 3 years I lived on a mine. And during those 3 years produced the 2 children. I mean, there was not much else to do at Orkney as a woman. Your husband is a mine doctor. So yes, that was 3 years in Orkney, and the children came, and then moved back to Joburg as soon as we possibly could.
Children, boy, girl?
I have a son, Chris, and a daughter, Nicola, who are now 37 and 35 years old. So
wow.
We're talking,
A few years ago.
A few years ago it was, a few years ago.
Okay. So just back to your upbringing, you mentioned that you were part of church. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Again, it comes back to family and the influence of family. My dad's father founded a church called Rosebank Union Church. So I've moved from one RUC to another RUC in my life. But Rosebank Union Church came about because the people who were wanting to start that church were living in what was then the remote suburbs, the remote northern suburbs of Johannesburg. And anybody who knows Johannesburg, we're talking Orange Grove and Rosebank, which now is completely part of a very busy metropolitan area. But for them, in those days, it was remote enough for them not to have a church.
Mm.
So some of them got together and they said, well, let's have a home church and a home place where we can worship. And it was, by its very nature, a mixture of denominations that were represented. And it grew, and they eventually decided, well, let's formalize this, and they found a church which was a tin shanty, and they started meeting there, and they established the Rosebank Union Church as a non-denominational church, and it still is, not in the tin shanty, but it still is a thriving church to this day. So so my upbringing was in this Rosebank Union Church, and my dad and his two brothers were also senior elders within the church, so there was a lot of Laburn association with the Rosebank Union Church in my years growing up.
Mm.
And I think with that came probably quite a lot of pressure to be this person, this member of this family and this church family.
Mm.
So that was my founding church memories, very strong and very strongly associated with that church.
But interestingly, you were saying, your father very connected with this church, but we don't talk politics, so there was no connection intellectually between, this faith that I'm part of and what's going on in the country, and
Not at all, which looking back on now was absolutely extraordinary. And as things started so I'm talking about when I'm very much younger, in primary school and even early high school years, and then things started to change. 76, I was already finishing university, so when some of certainly when the 1976 riots happened, I was still living at home. But I was much more politically aware by virtue of having been at Wits during that time, and my husband-to-be was very involved in political stuff going on campus. So there was absolutely an awakening, an awareness of things that were going on. But the church was, the church took the view, I think, that we render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and they were a down the line evangelical church. And I do recall my sister younger than I having some fairly robust discussions with my dad over issues of the church being compliant with the state and the church being supportive of what the state was doing by its inaction.
Mm.
I remember those conversations happening, and they were tough.
Mm. So things then evolved in the country, and there was massive change here. And how did that impact you and your family and your career? Let's say early 90s, when it was a very different looking South Africa.
Yeah. So when we came back from Orkney with two small children, I started working at Wits University as a part-time lecturer, back into the department that I had graduated from. By then I had a master's degree, and I was part of a new discipline called development planning.
Mm-hmm.
And we started a diploma course and then a master's course in that. So I was part of that and doing some teaching part-time with young children. And I'm just thinking what years those were. Into the early 90s, I was then a full-time member at Wits University, and I did something which it was only brought back to me a couple of years ago, in that I developed a course at Wits which was looking at pre-colonial settlements in South Africa. As part of this development planning course, I said to the prof, let's have a look. Town planning didn't start with Britain. We've immersed in town planning as something that came from our colonial heritage. But communities, the evidence, archaeological evidence, is that the Indigenous communities actually had very well planned and thought out settlements. And I think we should be teaching our students about this.
Mm.
So I wrote a paper and I produced a course which looked at pre-colonial settlements in South Africa. And that was in 1990. I don't know what happened to that course. I taught it for a couple of years, for 3 or 4 years, until I left, which we can come on to. But I was reminded of it when I was invited to, as part of UCT's program of urban planning, to mark and examine a student's dissertation. And lo and behold, she was quoting that paper that I wrote and looking at pre-colonial settlements as part of the whole decolonialization of the curriculum. And I just thought, wow, that was quite something. I didn't know what I was doing there. I just thought that this was something important, that we explored our pre-colonial planning history. And then that came back to me all those years later.
So I'm aware that there were some changes in your career, that, some travel, some changes of direction. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, precipitated by my husband, who decided he wanted to specialise and he wanted to test his specialist skills against the best in the world, and applied for and got a fellowship to the UK. And it was in 1994. And it was a real internal conflict that I had, because here was this amazing opportunity for him to go and work in the UK and put himself against the best in his field for a year. And here was South Africa on the verge of something that I really believed in and was excited about, and a future that just looked so amazing. And I was a senior lecturer at WITS. I had risen up, and that was my trajectory. That was who I was. That was who I was going to be. And off we went to England with the 2 children, at first just for a year for his fellowship. Children were 10 and 11 years old, so it was a very formative time for them as well.
Where in England?
For the first year, we went to Sheffield, and I established an association there with Sheffield University that continued for many, many years afterwards. But we spent a year in Sheffield, and then I came back with the 2 children on my own, because literally on the verge of that 1-year fellowship coming to an end, he was offered a permanent job. But I had a commitment to come back to WITS. So I came back with 2 children for 9 months, and it was tough. And then we went back to England on the 1st of January 1996 and moved to Birmingham in the West Midlands, where I then spent 16 years.
Wow.
So much for a one year stint, and we'll be back.
That's a long time, and I can't hear any Brummie accent whatsoever.
Definitely no Brummie accent. And my children didn't pick one up either.
For all those Peaky Blinders fans out there who...
Wow, yes, that was quite something, yeah.
So, wow, that's a long time to spend in the UK, and how was that for you? And, I guess someone who lived in the UK myself for a while, you get a whole different perspective of life being based there, being close to Europe, etc. How was that as an experience for you and for the family and, for your career?
Wow, there's a lot of things in that question, Russell. How is it for the family and the children? It was fantastic. It was fantastic for my husband's career. It took off, and he became a consultant and became very well established in his career. It was fantastic. For the children, they got an education that was fabulous. They went to really, really good local schools in Birmingham, and I'm not saying they wouldn't have had the same education here in South Africa, but they got a different education. They got a European education, and that set them off, and they they've gone on to achieve wonderful things. From my career, from the family point of view, it was great. We did a lot of travelling. We travelled through Europe. We went into all different countries in Europe and in Ireland, and had a fabulous time seeing the world, taking advantage of the fact that we were just a short hop away from all these amazing places in Europe. And it was a wonderful opportunity. It really was very special, and I have very, very happy memories of all of that travel. But from my career point of view, it was a complete grinding to a halt, really, of who I was professionally, because there was no rural community development happening in England the way I was getting into it in South Africa, working with communities who were reclaiming. Before I left, I'd become involved in working with communities who were reclaiming their land under the Land Restitution Act. Before it was, before 1994. So people who were fighting their removals. That was really what had become my interest. So that all was hard. It was hard to have to redefine myself, reinvent myself professionally. And frankly, I battled. I ended up, I lectured at University of Sheffield part-time for a little bit. And then I worked in Birmingham at the University of Central England, and later the University of Birmingham in a research capacity. And I just was part of small research teams who were working on urban issues in England, which frankly left me cold. I mean, it just did not excite me. It was a job. It was something to do, and I did it. But it was a tough place to be professionally for me for a long time, until I was made redundant because the research projects that we were working on, funding ran out. And that was a bit of a blow. It was a huge blow. Professionally, it was a blow to my pride as well, because nothing like this had ever happened to me. Apart from, if you think back to my childhood when I wasn't as successful as my three elder sisters had been at school and become head prefect and things like that, this was the first time when I had received a blow which said, you're not good enough, you're not actually good enough to be part of this team any longer, we don't have money, and the project is being closed down. It was a tough thing to go through. But I remained unemployed for about 18 months, applying all over the place to try and get to find work. And at that stage, the children had both finished school, so I was not Birmingham bound any longer. So I started looking for work elsewhere in the UK. I went back to my roots of development issues. And I thought, well, the only thing really that's going to get me back working in the thing that I originally loved and identified myself as something part of me was to look for international development organizations. And so I applied to a number, and I ended up volunteering with the Methodist Relief and Development Fund in London. So I would commute once a week down from Birmingham down to London, just to do a voluntary job, which was crazy in some respects. But that work experience eventually, I think, was part of what led to my successful application with World Vision. So World Vision took me on. By that stage, I'd finished my studies. I'd got a PhD as well. That's what I did when I was unemployed for those 18 months. Was I completed a PhD looking at communities trying to access their land in South Africa. So I was living in Birmingham, doing a PhD in Sheffield, studying two communities back in South Africa. It was really crazy, absolutely crazy. I would not advise anybody to do that. World Vision took me on as in a research capacity because they were busy expanding. This was 2004. There'd been an awful lot of money flooding into the international development world after the huge tsunami of 2001, and so they were expanding. Whereas the universities were cutting back on jobs, international aid agencies were busy expanding their work. And I went down so I then had a different commute. My commute was from Birmingham down to Milton Keynes, which is 100 kilometres. And I did that every single day. I did not go by train because I needed the flexibility of a car.
Wow.
So I commuted.
Driving.
I did a lot of driving down the M1 to Milton Keynes. But I suddenly found a job that made me feel alive again after 15 years, less than about 10 or 12 years of really being in the doldrums. It was exactly 10 years, 1994 to 2004. I suddenly, felt alive again and found a job that meant something to me.
And World Vision, obviously operating internationally, did that offer opportunities to travel and go to other parts of the world where their work was, being carried out?
Yeah, it was an amazing opportunity. So they took me on as a person who was going to come and help them with their research and the work that they were doing. Now, I joined a team, which was the policy team, as part of the broader advocacy department in World Vision. So advocacy is where you are lobbying governments to change policies that affect the children and the communities in which you're working around the world, producing policy papers to try and persuade and bring the facts to light and into the fore to try and persuade people. And that was heady stuff. That was just so exciting. To be head of research in the policy team was just amazing. And yes, it didn't afford me as much opportunity to travel as those who were involved in the actual projects themselves. But after a year or two, I was able to go and attend meetings and certainly see some of the work that World Vision was doing. And extraordinary organisation with a child focus in their development work and with a Christian focus. And it all just came together for me in an amazing way. And yes, I travelled. I went to Honduras, I went to Ecuador, I went to huge number of different places that I had the opportunity to travel and see the incredible work that World Vision does. And I eventually became head of the policy team at World Vision within the advocacy department, which was a huge privilege and just amazing. Within the policy team, we were focusing on child rights and child protection. We had specialists who were looking at HIV and AIDS and its effect on development and pushing very hard. And I had some, lots of criticism at that stage about South Africa's HIV. Well, that had passed, but there was a history there about South Africa's Thabo Mbeki's HIV and AIDS policies. Focus on disability issues in development and children who had disabilities and how they were being marginalised in their home communities and asking questions and doing some research about that. And then I was able to introduce issues looking at climate change and how that was affecting development and World Vision's work as well. So really challenging stuff and so exciting and so relevant.
But Kate, then at some point you found your way back to South Africa?
Yes. Another couple of crunches came my way. The first one is my marriage came apart after 29 years. And then simultaneously, World Vision's resources started to be cut back. And my team was downsized enormously, and my position eventually was also made redundant and incorporated into that of another team. So I had a double redundancy going on in 2000.
Pretty fundamental ones as well.
Yeah, pretty fundamental. It was at the time of the 2008 economic crisis. There was just so much going on in the world, and in my world, it impacted quite heavily on me. And so I found myself without a job again. Big blow, because that was a job that I really loved. And without a marriage. Children had left home by then, so I was sitting in Birmingham thinking, what am I doing here? And I thought, well, there's one thing for it, and that's just to go back home. So I came back.
Back to Joburg?
No, back to Cape Town.
So why Cape Town?
Too much history in Joburg. Even though my family, my sisters were there, and my parents, well, my father had passed, but my mum was still alive and she was in Joburg. But that's where there was just too much history, and I wanted a new start. I had a couple of two very, very good friends here in Cape Town who I knew would support me. And chose Cape Town. Why not? Beautiful place to live.
Yeah, and we're all glad you came this way. So, I mean, how's it been in Cape Town? As you say, you were left with these big holes in your life, going to a new city. I mean, I'm sure you've been here before, but not to live, and starting again almost. What did that look like for you, and how's it been?
Look, starting again is quite difficult. It's quite difficult to think of starting again, because now you're talking to somebody who is in her late 50s, coming back to South Africa, this fantastic, wonderful country with all of its problems. And I made a decision. Well, I didn't really make a decision, but looking around at the possible jobs that I could do and things that I could start again. I had been out of academia for too long, so I couldn't really take up a university and academic position any longer. I hadn't published, and I hadn't, I'd been doing international development. That didn't cut it academically. If I was going to take up a job in university. And I looked around and I thought, there weren't many jobs that are going in international development, probably are jobs that should be taken by younger people than me who are struggling to find work. So I decided not to try and progress my career. I mean, that sounds very euphemistically, but I was in a fortunate position because of my divorce to be able to cope financially without having to find work. And so I thought, well, it's really not, the right thing to do is to let younger people find their way on a career. So in fact, what I did start doing was working with UCT, with the students, a couple of students, mentoring them and supervising their dissertations and watching their progress as they go into the field, which is still an exciting field.
Which brings us to RUC, I guess, as well. And how did you find your way to this church?
With difficulty. I knew, so spiritually, I think I had been part of this Rosebank Union Church, which was a huge influence in my life growing up, in the sense of the need to conform and to be something, which I did for a while. And then after school, university, I guess I kind of drifted. I did still attend church, but it did not have a huge role in my life. My core beliefs were there and were solid, but I really battled with that particular church and with the evangelical church here in South Africa, and particularly in England, really not being socially active and aware and working for change. That's something that really I battled with. And in the UK, I did attend a church, but it was not something that was a feature, a highlight of my 16 years in England. Wonderful pastor, but just did not feel at home. Just felt like a fish out of water, spiritually and from the community point of view as well. Mm. So when I had made the decision to come back to Cape Town, to South Africa, and then to Cape Town, I knew there was one friend in particular who could connect me spiritually. And I emailed her, I said, I'm coming back to South Africa, which church do you go to? And she said, I don't. I don't go to church anymore, but I'm connected with the Centre for Christian Spirituality. And I can hook you up there, and there's some people who are really interested in important stuff and active and thinking. So I said, okay. So I arrived back here, and Julie met up with Sally and started looking around for a church, and again, just did not find one that I felt at home in. But through the Centre for Christian Spirituality, I went on a course. This was now my first year back in South Africa, and I was deliberately taking a year out to think about my life and where I was going to go. And part of that was a deliberate effort to do some spiritual work. And so I went on a course on deepening one's spirituality through the Centre for Christian Spirituality. And there I met Mimi Simon, who just completely had something that I knew was something special. I also met Peter Fox there on one of the courses. And Mimi encouraged me to come and visit Rondebosch United, and I did. She probably doesn't remember, but I did, and I attended, and after one or two services, I just knew this was home. This was a spiritual home. It was not preachy. It was not dogmatic. It was not, to use the phrase, dualistic. It was non-judgmental, and I felt very judged. I was going through a period of my life where I felt very judged. And I was just at home, accepted, and I felt, and the key, one of the key things for me was that the church had a social conscience, and I could see that working out in not just the Sunday services, but especially in the programs and various things that they were involved in. And yeah, I've never felt spiritually at home the way I do at Rondebosch United.
Wonderful. And Kate, the experience you shared of the double whammy you got all those years ago, I mean, what's sustained you through that? That must have been some very challenging times, and has faith been a component there, or how have you managed to see your way through that?
Faith has been a component. Lots of questions, lots of anger at God as to how could you let this happen to me, as if He let it happen to me, or she. But it was a case of why is this happening? What have I done wrong? What have this? I had a journey that I was on through life, and it was wonderful. I had lovely family and children and a career and all of these things, and I was going on this journey. And I guess what I came out of from that time of questioning and time of deep exploration, I guess, was that it wasn't that I was on a journey through life, but that actually life was taking me on a new journey. And it's been 10 years now since I've been back in Cape Town. what sustained me is partly this church and this community and finding things to do that give me meaning. Particularly what has sustained me is my children, who have been fantastic and who I think I have a closer relationship with my children now than I would have had if I'd stayed married. Because they've drawn me into themselves as I've drawn them into me. It's been I have a very special relationship with my children, and that's what's kept me going.
And what does the future hold? Do you have a sense
Oh,
of
I
what's
have
next?
no idea, absolutely no idea. Some of the things that I've taken up and do since I've been in Cape Town was the choir. I sing in the Symphony Choir of Cape Town, and that's been a lovely community that I'm part of, and you know how important music is. I spend a lot of time hiking on the mountains, despite my knees, which have given me trouble, but now I'm through it. And just I live in the most amazing place. I have this little dog who gets me up and makes me go walking every day. And it's just, I'm very blessed. And I cannot actually imagine living back in Birmingham again. And you know what the alternatives were, just don't want to even think about it. And as for the future, well, in the last year since I've been back here, I have had cancer and survived, and 2 knee replacement operations, and I'm through that. So I don't really think terribly much about what's next, because in my life I've been kind of hit with these things that have happened to me that are, you know, people have had much harder lives than I have, but I no longer think that I've got a life well planned out. I rather look forward to see what life is going to reveal to me.
Take each day as it comes.
Just about, yeah. But one of the things that we haven't talked about that the church has given me, great gift, is the soup kitchen out in Paarl, and so it's become an enormously important project for me, and in a way it ties back to World Vision and children and the development issues of poor communities. So there's a kind of a coming full circle through this church, through the project that was started there and that I continue to be involved in. So I've got little things that I'm involved in my life, and I hope it continues that way, and I look forward to new interesting things. I don't know. I don't know what they're going to be, or if they're going to be, but yeah, I'm in a good space.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate, for sharing so openly. It's been fascinating to get to hear much more about your story, and I'm sure everyone else has really appreciated that as well. So,
well, thank you, and thank you for all of these talks. I know I've enjoyed listening and watching some of the other interviews that you've done, and it's really made me feel connected back to people whose faces I would see in church on a Sunday and smile and say hello, but actually didn't know anything about them. And this has been a fabulous project of yours. And so thank you, because it's really made me feel connected again to the RUC community, who we've been so separated from for too long. And so bring on more of them, please.
Will do.